Can you hear me now? I think you can hear me now. Okay. I think you can hear me now. All right. So there's some button I have to click. And all right. So again, I apologize for that. So what was that button that I had to click? I had to click some button that to make this work. Okay. So back to the material for this week. And so let me open up the, I already said it, open up the lesson plan, go to the lesson plan here. And here you see the lesson plan. And to South Korea and Sweden, the United Kingdom show that joining the European Union makes European Union membership permanent. And that's, we have to make sure that we have enough time left over for that presentation. So I'm always thinking about how to make, try to make sure that the material in this class is relevant to what's going on in current events today. And we briefly mentioned this in a previous class that on Monday's class that Sweden is unique among the European Union countries. Not unique, actually. There's other European countries that have embassies with North Korea, official diplomatic relations with North Korea, including Bulgaria and Switzerland, and that those connections that those countries have, not the European Union itself, but those member states, is a main focus for European Union activity in Korea and East Asia. And it was important, for example, even during the Trump administration, because at one point the Trump administration, had very intense relations with North Korea, and then Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump met, I think a total of 3 times, and the Swedes played an important role. Sweden played an important role in helping set up those meetings. And so let me open this up here, show you news reports happening in 2018. So this is 4 years ago. Make sure that you can see this. Go to share screen. And so you can see North Korean foreign minister heads to, it says here, heads to Sweden before planned Trump-Kim summit. And I think this was the first time that Trump and Kim Jong-un of North Korea met. And this Sweden played a role in setting up this meeting. When Donald Trump started his administration after he was elected in 2016, he declared that if North Korea threatened the United States with nuclear weapons, that he would bring fire and fury on North Korea. And there was a escalation of tension. Even my friends, my Korean friends, asked me. There were rumors circulating that the U.S. Embassy was going to send out a notification to Americans to begin to evacuate, to leave South Korea. And I never received any kind of indication. I've never received any kind of message directly from the U.S. Embassy. And then there was the accident in which there was a accidental drill in Hawaii, in which the Civil Defense organization in Hawaii, the state of Hawaii, sent out mistakenly an SMS message to all Hawaiians through a text message that a missile, incoming missile, was coming into Hawaii. And this was an example of how these high tensions with nuclear weapons and vast military organizations involving tens of thousands of people, accidents could happen that could inadvertently or unintentionally lead to the beginning of violence and reactions by organizations that have already these plans, these massive plans in place already, that they are prepared to implement on short notice, that could escalate out of control. And we had examples of this in history, including in European history, with the outbreak of World War I occurring as a result of mutual fear and threat involving vast military organizations. And as the conflict escalated after the assassination by Serb nationalists of the Austrian Grand Duke, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian imperial throne, the emperor. The escalating conflict and the need to implement these vast organizational plans involving moving millions, literally millions of men by railroad became an important factor because the fear was that if a country was slow in activating its mobilization forces and moving its massive militaries into position, that they would be at a critical disadvantage at the beginning of a war because they were not prepared to deal with the enemy attack, and they would therefore perhaps lose the battle because they are not prepared. So they're rushing to prepare, they're rushing to escalate just to be safe in order to prevent being defeated in war and help produce the war that they feared and tried to avoid by preparing for their militaries. But the point is that this was an intense time. We think of Donald Trump and we remember with some fondness his meeting with Kim Jong-un on 3 occasions in Singapore and in Vietnam and in Seoul as well. He met Kim Jong-un at the DMZ. We think very warmly about these events, and Donald Trump brags about how he had excellent relations with Kim Jong-un, how they exchange warm and friendly letters to each other and notes to each other. But the first part of the Trump administration was one of threats and escalating tensions and conflicts that could have could have escalated out of control, as illustrated by that accidental ballistic missile warning that was issued by the state of Hawaii Civil Defense Forces. And I won't go into that here, but that first meeting to calm tensions between North Korea and the United States, Sweden played an important role here. So you can see here that the foreign minister of North Korea traveled to Sweden on Thursday. North Korea's state news agency reported Friday amid speculation surrounding Sweden's role in the preparations for the planned United States-North Korea summit in May. In a brief note, the state news agency KCNA said that the North Korean foreign minister Ri Yong-ho left Pyongyang on Thursday and meet with his counterpart Margot Elizabeth Wallström in Sweden to exchange views on the bilateral relations and issues of mutual concern. Remember, Sweden still has an open embassy in North Korea, along with Bulgaria and some other European countries. But of course, Sweden is a rich, prosperous country that has a reputation for being very efficient, unlike the Bulgarian government, for example. KCNA, however, did not mention in its report Pyongyang's plan to hold high-level meetings with US President Donald Trump on nuclear disarmament in May and with South Korean President Moon Jae-in in April. And it goes on here, he visited, foreign minister of North Korea visited Sweden after Sweden offered its help for the preparations of the summit between North Korea and the United States. And it goes on to describe here that the South Korean Unification Ministry has yet to decide on its stance towards Ri's trip to Sweden, according to a spokeswoman who spoke with EFA on Friday. But Swedish media reported that South Korea and US diplomats have together prepared for the meeting that will take place in Stockholm on Friday. And the Swedish government said in a statement that the talks will concentrate on Sweden's consular responsibilities as a protecting power for the United States, Canada, and Australia, and the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. And it goes on here, as Sweden's embassy in Pyongyang in North Korea houses a section addressing US interests on North Korean soil, the Nordic country has been an intermediary for communication between US and Pyongyang, which do not officially maintain diplomatic ties. And the Swedish embassy has been responsible for requesting and organizing diplomatic visits for US prisoners in North Korea. It's raising speculation that Ri's current trip to the Nordic country could lead to possible release of 3 US citizens currently imprisoned by North Korea as well. So Another way that the U.S. has diplomatic communication, official diplomatic communication with North Korea is also through North Korea's United Nations Embassy in New York City, its United Nations legation or representative office for North Korea in the United Nations, because North Korea, like South Korea, is in the United Nations. They are members of the United Nations, and so they have an office in New York so that they can practice their diplomacy within the United Nations framework. So there is on U.S. territory an official North Korea presence through the United Nations, but not a North Korean embassy in the United States. It goes on to highlight how in 2019, Sweden is prepared to host new talks for North Korea and United States. And it goes on to highlight here that Sweden also in January hosted a meeting where North and South Korean diplomats met with U.S. envoys. Again, this strong sense in North Korea, in dealing with North Korea, that in some sense that North Korea is still, in a sense, frozen in dealing with North and South Korea and the United States in terms of the start of the Korean War, right? That the North Koreans will talk to Sweden because Sweden played an important role in the ceasefire for the Korean War. These legacies of the Korean War were so powerful in terms of North Korea's collective attitudinal community development that they're still frozen in the Korean War in North Korea. Yeah, I get a sense of that in South Korea too, but it seems to be even stronger, much stronger in North Korea. Yeah, it's meant that Trump met Kim Jong-un on the military demarcation line inside the demilitarized zone, separating North and South Korea at the end of June. In 2019, agreed to resume working level negotiations in Pyongyang nuclear weapons program. And of course, nothing really came of these negotiations, of these face-to-face personal meetings between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. Agreements were not reached, but North Korea did stop its nuclear weapons tests and ballistic missile, ICBM long-range missile tests while Donald Trump was president. And now they have resumed those long-range intercontinental ballistic missile tests during the Biden administration in the United States. So let me ask you a question. Of course, there's much talk now about the war in Ukraine and how Sweden, which is not a member of NATO, but is a member of the European Union, would Sweden perhaps consider or be likely to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and no longer be officially neutral, even though even though the European Union is closely connected to the United States in many ways, Sweden is officially neutral because it's not a member of NATO. This concern about Sweden joining NATO has been an issue for the Russians for a long time. So you see here, for example, here's a report from, I think you can see this, right, from 6 years ago. This is 2 years after the Russian government helped partition or intervene to partition Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk region in Crimea that Russia annexed to Russia in 2 years previously in 2014. This is 2016. And this is the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who warned Sweden against NATO membership because Sweden was considering joining NATO in response to Russia's intervention in Ukraine, military intervention in Ukraine, including beginning a war there that would last from 2014, violence that would continue from 2014 until, of course, last month, well, in February, when Russia then undertook a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the violence had been continuing since 2014, and by the end of February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, at least 10,000, maybe more, people had already died in the fighting in Ukraine. I think at least 10,000, I think I hear estimates up to 14,000, and 1 million people had become refugees who had fled their homes in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. The average death toll from Ukrainian soldiers, that one Ukrainian soldier would be killed on average per week from 2014 until February 2022. So Ukrainian military already had experience fighting, was already fighting the Russian military, and Russia supported insurgents in eastern Ukraine. And so you see this, this report that Russia's Lavrov warns Sweden against NATO membership. And he said that Russia might punish Sweden or undertake countermeasures if Sweden joins the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Currently, Sweden is an EU member, but also has chosen not to be a NATO member, opting instead to retain its policy of military non-alliance that is pursued during the Cold War. The crisis in Ukraine, however, seems to have changed attitudes in Sweden, as a poll in September found that 41% of Swedes favored NATO membership, while 39% remained against it. I don't know, I haven't seen news reports about the latest public opinion polls in Sweden, to the extent to which we consider public opinion polls to be useful. They're problematic, you know. Public opinion polls are difficult to use to predict what kind of policies you should adopt. And again, Lavrov, foreign minister of Russia, warns Sweden that if NATO's borders crawl towards us, we have a way to respond. So again, Sweden's neutrality has been an important part of Sweden's foreign policy since 300 years ago, when it first got into the Great Northern War with Peter the Great of the Russian Empire. And this is coming under challenge now. And but we can come back to that later. But what I wanted to ask you was if you think that if Sweden were to join NATO, would Sweden's influence over North Korea decrease? Would Sweden's diplomatic bargaining leverage over North Korea decline if it joined NATO, and like Poland did, like Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic did? Switzerland is still not, of course, in NATO, nor is Switzerland in the European Union. Switzerland also has, of course, an embassy in North Korea. And as we mentioned, Kim Jong-un actually studied as a student, as a high school student in Switzerland under a false identity. Do you think that the crisis in Ukraine, if it intensifies and Sweden decides to join, considers joining NATO, would that result in Sweden having less influence in the world, including in North Korea, because it is no longer considered to be a neutral country? The other countries that were in the Joint Verification Commission that oversaw the ceasefire and the exchange of prisoners at the end of the Korean War, I should say, the end of the Korean War, included I think Poland and Czechoslovakia as well. Let me try to find that file. Yeah, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. And again, I'm going to make sure you can see that. And we already covered this earlier, so this looked familiar. This is the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, and included Sweden and Switzerland, and also Poland and Czechoslovakia. Of course, Poland and Czechoslovakia were communist at this time. And then, of course, in 1989, the communist governments collapsed. And the North Korea expelled these two countries from having observer functions in North Korea after their communist regimes collapsed. So if you go to the DMZ, I think you might still see a place where the Polish and Czech governments might have a place by which to have observers present if they want to, a place for them to live in apartments, small apartment blocks. But the North Korean government punished these two countries for becoming democratic countries and then joining NATO, right? Czechoslovakia no longer exists. It's now Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. But both Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland, they all joined NATO. And that resulted in, I think, let me see if I can find it here. It resulted in yeah, let me see if I can find it here where it says what happened. Following the collapse of communism, leading to Czechoslovakia and Poland joining NATO and the dissolution of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993, North Korea believed that the NSC had lost its neutrality, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission had lost its neutrality, and took the view that the NSC had collapsed. North Korea expelled the Czech component in 93 and the Polish component in 1995. And it says here, the Swedish and Swiss delegations continue to submit reports on the South Korean troop movements to North Korea, which are ignored. Poland continues to attend NSC meetings, Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission meetings, although it is no longer able to observe troops movements in North Korea. It says here, since 1995, North Korea has not recognized the existence of the NNSC. But still, you know, I mean, Sweden has some kind of influence so you can see here the Swiss staff members and the Czechoslovakia staff members. All right, so my question to you is to go back to, if we can find it here, the cyber campus, to vote on this topic. Do you think if Sweden joins NATO, then it will lose influence in Pyongyang? And that might be an important consideration. I could imagine, for example, how the Biden administration of the United States might consider Sweden not joining NATO because the Biden administration wants to have that channel of communication with North Korea through Sweden that Sweden has as a member of the European Union, because again, Switzerland is not a member of the European Union, Sweden is. Bulgaria is also in North Korea, has relations with North Korea. But I think we can, we have 2 agree and 3 neutral cannot, 2 neutral cannot decide. But, you know, if it doesn't really make any difference to the United States or other actors as to whether or not Sweden officially joins NATO, because it's in the European Union, Sweden therefore participates in the common foreign and security policy of the European Union and the European Union's common security and defense policy, which is the military framework, the national security framework for the common foreign security policy. Sweden participates in all of that. So Sweden is like Ireland. Ireland is also in European Union, but Ireland is not part of NATO. The Republic of Ireland is not part of NATO. But of course, the whole world expects that Ireland and Sweden have very close relations with the United States and the other NATO countries, even though they're not in NATO, right? So that might be a consideration if the Americans are seeking to reduce or prevent new crises from emerging when they're trying to focus on the Ukraine crisis and other crises elsewhere, that they might prefer to keep Sweden out of NATO in order to continue to utilize Sweden as a base for negotiations over North Korea's ballistic missile program as an asset or a means by which to engage in diplomacy with North Korea. So, all right, so let me go back to the notes and talk a little bit more about the notes. So another reason why Sweden is a lot in the American news, insofar as Sweden is covered in the American news media. 14 years ago, when the financial crisis began in 2008, when the global financial crisis began and then led to the Greek sovereign debt crisis in 2010 that you read about in last week's readings regarding Greece and Spain, the world was looking for examples or historical cases that they could use to compare with this global financial crisis, this banking crisis, this crisis that led to the deepest economic recession since the Great Depression, that was focused on banks and threats to banks. That much reference was made to Sweden, because Sweden had a banking crisis 30 years ago in the early 1990s. Sweden also had its own banking crisis in the early 1990s, before it even joined the European Union. And so there was much discussion about what was Sweden's experience in dealing with a financial crisis that was focused on the weaknesses of the banking system. And so there wasn't much examples of that in terms of post-war modern examples of how you deal with an economic crisis that's focused on the dangers to the banking sector. We haven't experienced that since the Great Depression in the 1930s. So there was a lot of discussion about the Swedish experience. What can we learn from Sweden in terms of how to deal with the banking crisis? So Sweden, by the way, takes pride in being neutral, but Sweden's neutrality in Europe has some resentment to it, because Sweden, for example, was not involved in the Second World War. Sweden was not involved in the Second World War, even as its Scandinavian allies in the Scandinavian countries. And the Scandinavian countries are Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, right? The Scandinavian countries. Denmark was attacked and occupied by the Germans. Norway was attacked and occupied by the Germans. Finland was attacked by the Soviet Union and fought off the Soviets for a while, but eventually lost. They made a peace with the Soviet Union and had to surrender territory. And then Finland was allied with the Germans against the Soviet Union during World War II, because they wanted to take back what the Soviets had conquered from them. But Sweden was not involved in this violence. And Sweden went so far, for example, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland in the Great Northern War, the Winter War in 1939-1940, there was much outrage in the world about how the Soviet Union was attacking Finland for no cause. Apparently, the Soviet Union under Stalin was aiming to take more territory from Finland in order to expand the security area around Leningrad, St. Petersburg, because it was vulnerable, because it was very close to obviously right next to the border with Finland. So they wanted more territory in Finland in order to expand the security perimeter around what is today St. Petersburg. So there's a Wikipedia. There's got to be a Wikipedia. I know there's a Wikipedia site for that. Let's try to see if I can find that Wikipedia site. I thought I already had the Wikipedia site open, but the point I wanted to make was that maybe it was a good thing, maybe it wasn't a good thing, but the British wanted to send aid and help to Finland to fight the Soviets. This is before Germany invaded. I'm trying to find this. I think I have to use the Finnish word. Yeah, so let me make sure you can see this. And here's the Wikipedia entry for the Russo-Finnish War, fought from 1930 to 1940. And the British wanted to send aid to help Finland fight the Soviet Union, and Sweden said no. Sweden said you could not cross Swedish territory. The British could not cross Swedish territory to send military aid and assistance to Finland, who were fighting the big, massive Soviet military. Little Finland, a country of even today is only about 5 million people, held off the Soviet Union for a surprisingly long period of time, but eventually they had to make peace with the Soviet Union. And then when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the Finns would be the allies of the Germans trying to take back the territory that they lost to the Soviet Union earlier. So the point I'm making is that there's some degree of sensitivity regarding Swedish neutrality. That Sweden is a free rider. Supposedly, the claim is that Sweden benefits from all the advantages of NATO security led by the United States, supposedly, yet is not willing to pay the price of being openly a NATO member, despite benefiting from its neighbors, Finland, and well, Finland's not part of NATO either, but Norway is part of NATO, and Denmark is part of NATO. So let me go through the notes here. But Sweden, of course, knows that it is like Germany, perhaps even more so. Sweden is dependent upon trade. Sweden depends for its economic well-being on having export markets for its goods, for its high value-added exports that companies produce, that they need to be able to sell those products and goods in order to maintain the very developed, prosperous economy and standard of living that Sweden is known for today. Now, keep in mind, like Switzerland, 200 years ago, Sweden and Switzerland were terribly poor countries, very poor countries. We have this image today that Sweden and Switzerland are prosperous, rich, developed states, and that's true. But I read one source claim that 20% of the population of Sweden in the 19th century left Sweden to go find economic opportunities in other countries, including in Denmark and in the United States. So 1/5 of the population of Sweden left Sweden and went to United States, particularly the central part, northern part of the United States, Minnesota and elsewhere. So Sweden has developed, and its exports have played a critical role, obviously, in its economic development. So that's always been a primary concern for Sweden, that even if it's going to be neutral, it still has to have excellent relations with rich, prosperous, powerful countries, if only to provide export markets for Swedish exports. So the UK and Denmark and Ireland, so Denmark is one of the Scandinavian countries, United Kingdom and Ireland joined the European Economic Community in 1973. Of course, Sweden did not join until 1995, but Sweden did form, with British leadership, the European Free Trade Area in 1960. So before Britain applied to join the European Economic Community, it also tried to provide leadership in creating a free trade area or in Europe for those countries that were not part of the European coal and steel community. And but then, of course, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Ireland joined the European Economic Community, and Sweden responded by signing a bilateral agreement with the free trade agreement with the European Economic Community to gain access to the common market. So you get a sense already from these notes that that joining the European Economic Community was seen as a pro-Washington position, a pro-United States position in the world, that there was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that the European Economic Community was very closely supportive of and related to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So joining the European Economic Community for countries like Ireland and Sweden was still seen, well, at least by Sweden, was seen and Austria also, which also joined after the Cold War ended in 1995. Austria, Finland, and Sweden all joined the European Union because the Cold War was over. The Cold War was over, and so the concern that the European Union was too closely allied with the United States in the Cold War with the Soviet Union was no longer an issue because the Soviet Union was gone. But again, Sweden has to have export markets for its export goods. And the pace of European integration accelerated in the 1980s, appearing to threaten Sweden's, again, with being marginalized economically in Europe. And again, I'll skip over my notes here. So Sweden and the other European Free Trade Area countries approved a comprehensive association agreement with the European Union in 1992 to create the European Economic Area. And by the way, as a side point, there's been some discussion about maybe Britain trying to revive this European Free Trade Area now that Britain is no longer part of the European Union, that it might be predisposed to some kind of free trade agreement with other countries, reenacting or reviving this type of association between, if not Sweden, then with European Union and United States and Canada. As I already mentioned, Britain has joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though Britain's a long way from the Pacific Ocean. After Boris Johnson became Prime Minister of Great Britain in early 2020, one of his first acts as Prime Minister of Britain was to apply to join the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the free trade agreement between Japan, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Singapore, and a number of countries. Originally was supposed to include the United States, and then Donald Trump withdrew his American willingness to join the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. But Britain has joined, along with Australia and Canada, the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, the disintegration of the USSR, and the expansion of the European Union to Eastern Europe appeared to threaten Sweden again with being marginalized in Europe economically. So limiting itself to the European Economic Area, it's described here, right, meant that Sweden would have to accept all European Union laws without having a formal voice in making them, as long as it remained outside the European Union. So the Social Democratic government of Sweden, the long-running government that had been in power for most of the post-World War II era, the Social Democratic Party, that gets much of the credit for creating the well-known and famous developed Swedish welfare state, announced in 1990, again, the Berlin Wall had collapsed, the Cold War was over, that it would seek the European Union membership, and that surprised some people. It was announced at the list of policies that the Swedish government would adopt in order to address a deep economic crisis confronting Sweden at this time. So this is the banking crisis also that's going on. Swedes had mixed feelings about joining the European Union in 1995. But by 2005, more Swedes supported the European Union membership, double than those who said they opposed it in public opinion surveys. And so the Swedish administrative and political elite have taken an increasingly active stance in the European Union. And I should tell you that I don't think this is really mentioned in the chapter that you read on Greece, but in the other textbook that I used previously, it's now out of date, that was published in 2015, the chapter on Sweden by the author, a Swedish author, notes that Sweden also was playing an active role in advising the Greeks, in advising Greece and the Greeks in revising and reforming their policies and their administrative state structures. Because again, Sweden has this reputation of being one of the most efficient and effective and non-corrupt pro-government, pro-capitalist, but pro-capitalist, pro-market governments in the world. That it's a small country, I know, it's a very small country. It's a fraction of the size of France or Germany or Italy, but it has a reputation of being a world leader in efficient government and with an effective civil service. And why is this important? Of course, your book was published in 2020, so the pandemic began after the book was published. But Sweden adopted a unique set of pandemic Corona-19 pandemic virus policies that did not involve shutting down the economy, did not involve closing restaurants and schools, and it wasn't clear that this policy was desirable in the view of other countries, but Sweden's response to the pandemic was unique. And one of the explanations that Swedish authorities gave for justifying their policies is that you don't need to tell Swedes, the Swedish government does not need to force Swedes or coerce Swedes to do what the Swedish government needs them to do. That the Swedish public, they claimed, trusts the Swedish state. So if the Swedish state advises them to act in certain ways, Swedes will do it. So we don't have to threaten people with fines and judicial punishment for breaking a social distancing recommendations to deal with the pandemic. So Sweden's response to the pandemic got lots of press coverage all over the world, including the United States, particularly from those groups that were cynical and suspected or suspicious of the powerful role of the central government in responding to the pandemic by placing limitations and restrictions on American behavior, American consumer behavior, American social behavior. There was lots of attention focused on Sweden. And I think I might even have those policies mentioned here. Yeah, here you see the COVID-19 pandemic in Sweden. You know, you have Wikipedia entries for everything these days, but this says it's out of date. Well, this is from just this month. This article may be too long to read and navigate comfortably, so that's April 2022. Some people claim that this is out of date. So you can see this has been kind of controversial because particularly, for example, as I mentioned, the way many Americans, as we talk about in my American politics class, have a tradition, a cultural predisposition to be suspicious and resistant to strong central government authority to deal with the with the COVID-19 pandemic. Those who were libertarian and focusing upon individual freedom often would point to Sweden as an example. So you can see it is kind of controversial. I mean, it's not often you see these kinds of arguments happening in Wikipedia. So, but as I said, one of the justifications that Swedish people would give for their government's behavior and the public's behavior and acceptance of it is that the Swedish people have a trustful relationship with the Swedish government. Okay, so patterns of Sweden's membership of the European Union. So Sweden was a reluctant skeptic of the European Union, believing in its own exceptionalism, including in that it has particular capabilities and skills that might be exploited and resources that might be exploited by the weaker and poorer and more corrupt members of the European Union. So as you know, Sweden still to this day is not part of the Eurozone. And even though Sweden has an effective state, even though Sweden provides advice to Greece, for example, on how to reform its policies. And as you read in the chapter on Sweden, Sweden is also playing a cooperative role with Poland in helping the Polish government carry out reforms and changes that, even though it has this expertise reputation, it is still not willing to join the Eurozone. Even though joining the Eurozone would place it in a leadership position in the European Union, because only 19 of the 26 members of the European Union are in the Eurozone. So 8 countries are not in the Eurozone, and they include Denmark and Sweden. They're not in the Eurozone. And those are 2 rich, prosperous European countries like Germany, like France, like Spain and Italy, but they're not in the Eurozone. There are perceived threats to Swedish national sovereignty were phrased in terms of threats to losing Sweden's exceptionalism or Sweden's Swedishness, that Sweden is more advanced in the European Union regarding for example, its foreign security policy, its tradition of neutrality, its focus on humanitarian global issues, its emphasis on the United Nations as a route by which Sweden can play an active role in global affairs, this little country of under 10 million people. And that includes its neutrality, that its neutrality was important. Its democratic principles and norms are, of course, claimed to be unique or exceptional, and the Swedish welfare state, as I already mentioned. It was perceived, this uniqueness, this Swedishness, as requiring the pursuit of an independent economic policy. During the Cold War, Sweden claimed it pursued a foreign policy with a strong human rights and internationalist orientation. Keep in mind, during the Cold War, there was tremendous brutality and violence during the Cold War. We call it a Cold War because the United States and the Soviet Union never engaged in a direct conflict with each other, but they fought their nuclear conflict, their nuclear armed conflict indirectly in intervening overtly or covertly in all the countries of the world, including in Korea and in Vietnam. Millions of innocent people died during the Cold War. Keep that in mind. I mean, we're focused on the terrible carnage and violence in Ukraine and Ethiopia and in other countries, but the Cold War was not any more peaceful. When you think about how the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies intervened overtly, as I mentioned, in Afghanistan or Vietnam or Korea, or covertly providing weapons and guns and military aid and economic aid and to an encouragement to their local allies to fight against the allies of their Soviet enemy or of their American enemy. So being internationalist and human rights oriented, that to many Americans who viewed that the Soviet Union was a terrible threat attempting to conquer the world for communism under the Soviet leadership, Sweden's claim about human rights and internationalist in its orientation, that often irritated many Americans who viewed countries like Sweden as benefiting from the security, supposedly benefiting as a free rider from the security the United States provided without paying the costs. Sweden appeared to have more influence in international relations than one might expect, with a population of about 10 million people because of its neutralist internationalist position in a divided Europe. It strongly supported the United Nations. It donated exceptional amounts of aid to the third world. That's Asian and African and Latin American countries that declared themselves to be neutral as well in the conflict between the Soviet Union and its allies and the Americans and their allies. And it defended Asia and Africa. After joining the European Union in 1995, Sweden shifted towards supporting the European Union's common foreign security policy. It's not part of NATO, though. So it'll be interesting to see if Sweden does join the does choose to join NATO, but I can't imagine it would do that unless Finland also joined NATO. Finland, its neighbor to the east that fought that war with the Soviet Union in 1939-1940. Sweden has joined the European Union's permanent structured cooperation of the European Security and Defense Policy. So this PESCO, European Union's permanent structured cooperation, that is the foundation for creating a truly European military, economic, and political infrastructure for building a European military security and supply infrastructure, including like European military infrastructure, including corporate manufacturing capability to provide the European Union with European corporate military suppliers. But again, in responding to the current crisis in NATO, current crisis in Ukraine, I should say, we see that the European Union is falling back on NATO immediately, as already mentioned, how, for example, Germany announced 2 or 3 weeks ago that it's going to buy American fighter planes and not try to build its own German European fighter planes the way they did in the 1980s when the Germans and the French and others created the European Tornado fighter jet. they're not doing that. They're not going to, well, they are going to continue to do that, but not as much as we might expect. They're going to, again, fall back on relying upon American corporate suppliers like Lockheed Martin that builds the F-35 that South Korea is also purchasing. Terrorism also motivates Sweden to consider closer cooperation with NATO. In 2015, Sweden had a generous asylum policy, but Swedes are, much of the Swedish population is nationalistic. I'm not saying they all are, but Sweden is a country that is until recently relatively homogenous in its ethnic and religious sectarian identity. And of course, like the rest of Europe, it has become more diverse with migration. And then during the 2015 immigration crisis, the Swedes began to restrict their immigration policies for people coming into the European Union from Africa and Asia primarily. Again, we'll see how many immigrants the Swedes will accept from Ukraine. Again, much has been made about about the difference, for example, in how the Europeans are treating Ukrainian migrants compared to migrants from Africa or Asia and Muslim countries. Sweden has also criticized Turkey for its increasing authoritarianism under the Erdogan presidency. And so Sweden is also acquiesced to basically freezing Turkey's current official candidate EU member status. And so again, if the European Union does add new members, like for example, it's more likely, I think, Ukraine's going to join the European Union than Turkey. Even, as you might know, the Ukrainians have applied for emergency application to join the European Union after Russia invaded. The European Union was typically viewed as opaque in bureaucratic behavior and complex in decision making, which is seen as a threat to Swedish democratic traditions and principles. So the European Union, of course, is a complicated organization with 27 member states, and so it emphasizes communication, long, exhaustive discussions, many different levels, and its processes for making policies involve complicated bureaucratic behaviors, which many people, not just Swedes, claim is contributing to the so-called democratic deficit in the European Union compared to, for example, nation states like Sweden or France or Germany, where, if you're a typical Frenchman or a typical Swede, you believe that the rulers of Sweden, the government of Sweden is in this monarchy, the constitutional monarchy of Sweden, that the government of Sweden represents the will of the Swedish people, whatever that mystical, vague notion really means. But the European Union, it's become more and more complex over the years and expanded in more and more areas and expanded in its size. And if I'm habituated or take for granted what it means to be a Swede in Sweden, and I just accept my relationship to the Swedish government as legitimate, this emergence of this new entity called the European Union, with its complicated decision-making procedures, that's going to look unusual and new and increasingly perhaps dangerous to me, or at least as a topic of concern, as this thing called the European Union develops more and more policy competencies in more and more different areas, including now, in response to the Ukraine crisis, developing a genuine European military capability. And if I'm a Swede, who is typical in terms of education level, whose job and professional life is not connected to Europe, I might feel some insecurity about the concern that this European Union and its close NATO allies are going to make decisions that's going to affect the well-being of Swedes or Hungarians. And that was in fact used by Viktor Orban, the quasi-authoritarian ruler in Hungary. He just won again elections in Hungary a couple of days ago, who has been criticized, Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party, for being not supportive of principles of democracy, including a free and independent press, media, and he successfully won his election to be the third longest ruler in Europe today, after Putin and Lukashenko in Belarus. Viktor Orban, in his political campaign, appealed to Hungarians to support him because he's a Eurosceptic, and he will make sure that the European Union and NATO do not push Hungary to send Hungarian soldiers to somehow be involved in the conflict in Ukraine. And it might sound obscure, it might sound outlandish or ridiculous, but that evidently was an important part, according to the media reports I see today, of how Viktor Orban was able again to win a big majority through other means as well, including gerrymandering and other means of manipulation, but claiming that you can count on Viktor Orban making sure, fellow Hungarians, that I will not allow the European Union somehow, or NATO, led by the United States, somehow to require us, Hungary, the Hungarians, to send our Hungarian soldiers to be involved in the fighting in Ukraine. And that keeps coming up as one of the successful campaign slogans or promises that Viktor Orban utilized. And it reflects this concern that basically this European Union, who knows how they decide how to do things. I mean, you and I may know, you and I may pay close attention, but most people in Switzerland or Sweden or Germany or France or Spain or Italy do not. They do not pay close attention to political affairs in general, not to mention the complex and opaque and decision-making in processes and institutions of the European Union. Swedes view themselves as typically emphasizing consensus between political elites and the electorate. In other words, they just habitually trust the government. Since membership, the mainstream parties have emphasized the EU is not a challenge. So the main leading parties, again, this has come under challenge since the European Union has developed, but the ruling parties that dominated Switzerland after the Second World War, they have not emphasized the European Union as a challenge. But then in 2009, when the last formal treaty was adopted to develop further the European Union, to create a president of the European Council, and to develop the common foreign security policy, as we mentioned in the introduction to this course, that's when we start to see the emergence of strong Eurosceptic movements and Eurosceptic parties in European Union countries, including in Sweden. Of course, this has been emphasized by the Left Party, which is the former Communist Party of Sweden, and the right-wing Sweden Democrats. They are the populists, anti-immigrant, xenophobic nationalists, and they have emerged to become a major party in Sweden, along with the large influx of immigrants into Sweden. And the Swedish government has been an enthusiastic proponent of reform in the European Union, and it has promoted transparency in the European Union, including opening up documents, European Union documents, to everyone who wants to view them in the European Union. It's been a strong advocate of gender equality, and it included gender equality. It pushed to include gender equality as a fundamental principle of the European Union, beginning with the Amsterdam Treaty of 1997. That was the treaty that was adopted after the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union. So all Swedish commissioners on the European Commission, so each member state sends a person to be a commissioner on the European Commission, right? So there's 27 member states, so there are 27 members of the European Commission, right? And Sweden, each person that Sweden has sent to be a commissioner on the European Commission has been a woman. Sweden has been disciplined financially in carrying out its obligations, including maintaining fiscal restraints so that its budget deficit is not really large, even though it's not a member of the Eurozone. Again, even though Sweden is not part of the Eurozone, it has been supportive of efforts to develop the financial capability of the European Union, the financial stability of the Eurozone, even though it's not in the Eurozone. And including going back to the Treaty on Stability, Coordination, Governance in the Economic and Monetary Union of 2012 to deal with the Greek financial crisis. Sweden's has met its commitments under this treaty, again, even though it's not part of the Eurozone. So I keep wondering if, Sweden at some point will join the Eurozone, but just by reading the American media reports, I'm not seeing any indication that that's really likely, that Swedes are talking about doing that. Of course, the United Kingdom never joined the Eurozone as well. Reluctance among the Swedish public about joining the Eurozone stems from fear over ending Swedish regulation of their economy, along with doubt regarding the capability of other countries to respect the Stability and Growth Pact. This requirement that a government of a member state of the European Union should have as a principle no more than 3% budget deficit, that the budget deficit of the government, spending more money than it receives in taxes, produces a budget deficit, right? So that deficit should be no more than 3% of the total gross domestic product of that country. And this is a principle that all of the member states have signed on to, but very few actually meet. And another part of the Stability and Growth Pact is that the total accumulated deficit from borrowing over the years that a government has borrowed because of its annual budget deficit should be no more than 60% of gross domestic product. So those are two fundamental principles that all the member states have signed on to, and very few actually meet. And one of the few that does meet it is Sweden. And again, the Eurozone crisis, the sovereign debt crisis from 2010 to 12, reinforced Swedish skepticism of economic and monetary union, in other words, the euro. And other countries like Greece, but not only Greece, were seen as unable to manage their finances due to their governance weaknesses. And so there was another referendum in Sweden in 2003 asking the Swedish voters, do they want to join the Eurozone? And the Swedish voters said no. And but the Swedish elite, the Swedish leaders do want Sweden to play an active role for various motivations. They have emphasized Sweden's participation in the Europe 2020 strategy. I think you don't hear much about the Europe's 2020 strategy because, of course, the world has dealt with a series of crises since then, including the coronavirus pandemic and now the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So, well, it'll be interesting to see if Sweden's position, how Sweden responds as the pace of European integration and the depth of European integration to include, for example, more military focus, how the Swedes will react to that. And, the Swedish governments have been promoting their own national model as a model for best European practices, including, for example, in Poland and Greece. Yeah, I mean, the textbook, when you read the textbook, they don't really want to talk too much about nationalism, but this history of Sweden's greatness and then its decline to a lesser power after its exhausting defeat by the Russian Empire and the 300 years ago, any Polish nationalist, and Poland is an intensely nationalistic country, just like Russia, just like France, just like the United States, just like China. Any Polish nationalist will tell you about how Poland's greatness collapsed or began to decline during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. So 80 years before Sweden got involved in the war with Russia in the early 18th century, during the 17th century, there was a vast destructive war in Europe called the 30 Years' War. And the Swedish king under Gustavus Adolphus was a major power in the 30 Years' War. And this war led to the deaths of almost half of the population of what is today Germany, or the German lands. So this was horribly destructive. I mean, 40% of the German population died during the 30 Years' War. And Sweden was a major player in that war. And any Polish nationalist will tell you about the Swedish flood, the Szwedzki potop in Polish, the Szwedzki potop, the Swedish flood, that this was the beginning of the end of the Polish state because of the tremendous destruction that the Polish land suffered as a result of the Swedish Protestant invasion. Protestant religious Sweden was a Lutheran country that under Gustavus Adolphus was fighting against the Pope, against Catholic Poland. And the Swedish flood, the Szwedzki potop, was terribly destructive in Swedish lands. And I know, of course, anybody in Poland knows about the Szwedzki potop, the Swedish flood. And now we have Sweden playing an active role in attempting to counsel and partner with Poland in dealing with the challenges of Poland's integration in the European Union. And it's the point I'm trying to make is that that would be highly symbolically significant to any Pole. So let's see here. I've never checked. What does it say here? No, it's not great. It's a 30 years war. This was a war that, of course, also created the, I think you can see that, right? That created the legal foundations for modern Europe because it established the principle that states are sovereign, not the Pope. The Pope cannot tell governments how to rule their countries. Each member state of Europe has the right to be the ultimate authority. So you can see divided into Lutheran and Catholic states, the kind of atrocities committed during the 30 Years' War. You can see here, and you can see Gustavus Adolphus. Look at all these Swedish commanders. This is at the height of Sweden's power, right? In the 30 Years' War, and then Sweden would remain a great power, and then until Peter the Great in the Great Northern War defeated Sweden in an exhaustive war that set back Sweden as a great power to become a lesser power for the rest of its modern history. And so back to the okay, so the rest of this is a discussion of the party system in Sweden. Since we're running out of time to cover all of these countries. So EU membership has affected almost all aspects of Swedish politics and administration. And the Swedish parliament was regularly consulted in Sweden's European Union accession in the mid-1990s. Again, the Swedish parliament gave the Swedish government autonomy in negotiating with joining the European Union. And again, there's some discussion about the institutional arrangements created for monitoring the European Union affairs, keeping in mind that most people in Sweden don't focus much or know much about the details of Sweden's EU membership. This is primarily a concern for political elites, but at the same time, political elites will exploit it, particularly those on the right-wing political parties in Sweden and elsewhere, appealing to Swedish voters to vote for them because of the supposed stereotype threat of the sovereignty of the Swedish nation under challenge from European integration and blaming European integration and European Union for all of these migrants coming into Sweden from Asia and Africa, because it's much easier for them to come to Sweden because Sweden is part of the European Union. And that's what these Eurosceptic parties everywhere in Sweden, in France, in Italy, in all of the member states use to try to win votes, that the European Union is a danger to the sovereignty of our country, particularly because the European Union is making it too easy for immigrants to come into our country as their right once they cross the border into the European Union. So there's discussion of the parliamentary committees, and I guess this is interesting to know insofar as if you're going to try to create an integration mechanism, that each of the member states in Sweden or Denmark or Poland or Bulgaria or Germany or France or Italy, they have to decide how they're going to set up the institutions for monitoring and implementing European Union politics and policies, and implementing the directives and regulations that the European Union creates. And keep in mind, the European Union is a small organization in terms of the number of people that work for it. Only about 40,000 people are directly employed by the European Union. Only about 40,000 people. That sounds like a lot. That's the size of the Paris city government in France. I mean, that's the size of a city government of a big city in Europe. The European Union relies upon the member states. The European Union relies upon each of the member states and their civil service, their bureaucrats, their legislatures to actually implement the policies, directives, and regulations that the European Union adopts in Brussels through a proposal from the European Commission that is then considered by the European Council of Ministers, that is then, and by the European Parliament. Okay, they might pass a law. How is that law or regulation or directive implemented in all the 27 member states? It's done by the Swedish government, the French government, the Italian government, the Polish government, and so on. And so each of these member states has to decide by themselves, of course, with advice and observation of the other countries, what's the best way for Poland or Sweden or Italy to go about implementing what the European Union has agreed to do in their own country, in creating the common market, the single market with the free movement of goods, services, capital, labor. What do you have to change in Italy in order to meet the European Union obligations regarding, for example, digital cell phone roaming? You can get directives and proposals and frameworks from Brussels, but there are already Italian laws that exist, and you have to modify those laws in Italy, in Spain, in Sweden, in France, to make them conform with European Union goals and directives. So each of these countries has their own unique way of implementing and creating the structures, including the parliamentary committees, the executive branch, ministerial departments, for monitoring and implementing European Union policies that the member states have to implement in the Spanish way, in the unique Irish way, in the unique Italian way, in the unique Swedish way, in the unique Bulgarian way. And that's a theme that emerges in the book. The book will conclude by claiming that when you look at what has been the trends and processes of European integration, you don't see Italy becoming more like Poland and Poland becoming more like Italy, and Italy and Poland becoming more like Greece, and Greece becoming more like Sweden. You don't really see that. They aren't adopting the same kinds of institutions. They're harmonizing, but they're harmonizing, utilizing their own unique bureaucratic traditions and developing those bureaucratic and administrative traditions to accommodate more effectively doing what they agreed to do as a member state of the European Union when the European Union adopts a policy. So the belief that Italians, Spaniards, French, Poles, Greeks, they're all becoming the same in terms of their moving towards the same point, becoming the same in their local institutions. It's not correct. That's very oversimplistic. So, of course, this threat and challenge of nationalism is always present in these countries, and that meant trying to persuade skeptical, more nationalistic groups in Sweden or other countries that the Swedish government and the Swedish parliament is still primarily representing the will of the Swedish people, and that it has ultimate authority over the well-being of the Swedish people, not the European Union, not the European Union. And so this is always a concern, right? Nationalism is always a sleeping tiger that the European Union is trying to avoid instigating, at least in the member states. And so the Swedish parliament, up until 2014, was the most active in the European Union among all the national parliaments, utilizing the rights that the national parliaments have to communicate directly to the European Commission if the European Commission is adopting rules that the national parliament does not like. So the Swedish parliament communicates directly, has the right to communicate directly with the European Union institutions, not through the Prime Minister of Sweden. They can communicate directly to the European Union institutions. And that was included in the Lisbon Treaty from 2009. Again, to try to persuade Swedes and Italians and Spaniards that the European Union is truly democratic. The European Union is not a threat to democracy among the peoples of Sweden and Italy, that you can have your voice represented, that your voice is heard, that you can participate, that you can influence the European Union. The European Union is not a threat. The European Union is your friend. And of course, it's not easy to do. And Viktor Orban in Hungary continues to win elections by appealing to this suspicion among many Hungarians that the European Union is a threat to the sovereignty of Hungary. And of course, the European Union tries to appeal to people in ways they understand. I mean, not like you and me, but most people in Europe, like most people everywhere, they love sports, right? So if you try to appeal to Europeans to persuade them that there's not a democratic deficit in Europe, you might appeal to the European Union by claiming that the European Union is violating some principles with the subsidiarity rights of the member states to maintain their own national authority, that the European Union, according to subsidiarity, it's a principle that is officially part of the European Union, that the European Union will only take the powers it needs, will only have the powers it needs to do what the member states cannot do. So the lowest level of government in Europe should be responsible for addressing a problem. If the national governments cannot address a problem sufficiently or effectively, then that issue might move up to the European Union level. So that's the principle of subsidiarity. So if the Swedish parliament claims that, the European Union is threatening the subsidiarity rule, that Sweden should be responsible for this policy, not the European Union, they can issue a yellow card, like in soccer, football, the umpire waves a yellow card. And most people, even if they do not read or study the European Union, they know about soccer, they know about yellow cards. So you like European Union, yeah? Yes, of course you do. So, because that's the main problem in terms of public relations for the European Union, that the so-called democratic deficit. exists. In other words, your typical citizen of the European Union does not feel that the European Union is somehow representative of who they are. They know what the Swedish government is. If I'm a Swede, I know what Sweden is, and I know what the Swedish government is. If I'm Italian, I know what Italy is, and I know what the Italian government is. And the Italian government, yeah, I guess they represent me as an Italian living in Italy. But how do you convince people that the European Union is not a threat, is in fact representing their interests and who they are? You have to increase the participation opportunities. So that's been a focus of the European Union, but it's not easy to convince people because, you know, do you really believe, or do I really believe that if I'm an Italian, that the Italian government represents me? Or is it just a habit to believe that? Even if it's not true, and it's just a habitual way of thinking in my brain, still it's there. And if I'm a politician, I have to win elections, and my opponents will do whatever they can to appeal to voters to vote for them, including appealing to my fears and concerns about this European Union. This is some new big thing. What does it mean? Is it going to take away the ability of Hungary to determine where its own soldiers will fight in wars? Oh my God, no, no, no. That's your world in liberal democracy. Yeah, and you have to address it. Okay, so I'm going to have to, in a few minutes, shut down the classroom computer and open up my laptop because I need to save this recording. But so there's more discussion about, you know, again, keep in mind as you're reading this section, and this might seem, oh, this is so detailed. Sweden is supposedly a model for an efficient, developed, effective state. And so when you read about how the European Union executive branch and legislative branch of government have attempted to modify themselves and structure themselves, including in Spain or in Italy or in Poland, that this is a case of the state in the European Union that has probably the best reputation of being an effective, efficient model of an administrative state. And again, the European Union is all about best practice. What can we Italians or Greeks or Bulgarians or Spaniards learn from Sweden? And we should learn from Sweden because we're all Europeans. Yay! And we can trust each other and love each other and learn from each other without being afraid of each other. Okay, so, you know, I won't go into the details here because we should go to our debate. And, you know, I haven't really talked about the United Kingdom very much this week, partly because, well, I mean, I wonder why in this book they decided to include a chapter on the United Kingdom, even though the United Kingdom is not a member state of the European Union anymore. And I think it's because the authors know that we should try to understand what happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. Brexit was not supposed to happen. I mean, if you had asked me 6 years ago, in 8 years ago in 2014, is Britain going to leave the European Union? I would have thought no, countries can't leave the European. They wouldn't leave the European Union. It would cost too much economically. They're too economically integrated. They won't do that. And the British did it. Although what it means is not really clear fully, even to this day, since they voted to leave 6 years ago, already 6 years ago in 2016. So this chapter is trying to understand how Britain came into the European Union and then became increasingly Eurosceptical under Margaret Thatcher. And then to most people, not everybody, but to most people's surprise, had a referendum and then they voted to leave. And perhaps they shouldn't have been surprised I mean, even the pro-European French rejected the Constitution Treaty, the draft Constitution Treaty in 2005, 11 years before the Brexit vote. And that's been a country that's been an engine of European integration, along with Germany, a main driver of European integration. So I guess because I'm going to shut down this computer and then open up my laptop, and so it'll take me a minute or two, that just keep that in mind, that the mass of the population, even in the most integrated countries in Europe, still are predisposed to nationalism. And again, there's discussion going on right now about how Marine Le Pen is rising in the polls in France, and she will probably come in second in the upcoming elections in Paris, in France, for president, I think this weekend. And then she will go up against Emmanuel Macron in the second round. And people are concerned that she might actually win in France. Okay, so that's where I have to close down the classroom computer and then open up my laptop. So this will take a minute, okay?